The presses never stop. In the early hours before dawn, inside a guarded building in Tokyo, machines pound rhythmically against paper. Ink dries under hot lamps. Stacks of fresh notes are bundled, counted, and rushed away before daylight. Outside, the city is dark. Fuel is scarce. Sirens interrupt sleep. Trains run late. Goods are disappearing from shelves. Yet the money supply is growing. Japan is losing the war, but its economy is still moving. Factories continue to operate. Workers still receive wages. Military contracts are signed and paid. On paper, the system looks intact. Prices are controlled. Inflation appears contained. The currency still circulates. This is the mystery. How does a nation under blockade, bombing, and material shortage keep functioning without financial collapse? How does an economy keep breathing when its lifelines are being cut one by one? The answer lies not in production but in illusion. Because long before Japan's military defeat became inevitable, its financial system had already crossed a dangerous threshold. The economy was no longer anchored to real value. It was being held together by paper, pressure, and silence. This story is not about sudden ruin. It is about buying time. To understand how Japan reached this point, we have to go back before the illusion, before the presses ran day and night, when the war still seemed manageable and money still meant something. At the start of the conflict, Japan entered with confidence and calculation. The state mobilized industry, labor, and finance with remarkable speed. Banks were brought into line, capital markets were directed toward war production. The central authorities gained unprecedented control over credit. At first, the system worked. Military expansion created demand. Factories expanded output. Employment rose. Government spending surged, but it was partially financed through borrowing and forced savings. Citizens were encouraged, then required to purchase war bonds. Consumption was restricted. Imports were reduced. Controls were framed as patriotic duty. Money still had a tether. But war is expensive in ways that compound. As the conflict widened, Japan faced a fundamental problem. It lacked secure access to critical resources. Fuel, raw materials, food, everything had to be imported across vulnerable sea lanes. As those routes came under increasing pressure, costs rose sharply. Production did not stop, but inputs became harder to obtain. The government responded with controls rather than correction. Prices were frozen. Wages were regulated. Rationing expanded. Black markets were officially denied and unofficially tolerated. These measures masked the strain, but they did not remove it. Behind the scenes, deficits exploded. Military spending dwarfed peacetime budgets. Tax revenues could not keep pace. Borrowing from the public reached its limits. Banks absorbed government debt, but balance sheets began to distort. At this point, the first quiet decision was made. Rather than allow prices to rise or credit to tighten moves that would reveal weakness, the state chose expansion. More currency, more credit, more paper claims on an economy that could no longer deliver equivalent goods. The printing presses accelerated. On paper, nothing broke. In reality, everything shifted. Money stopped being a measure of value and became a tool of command. It told factories what to make. It told workers where to go. It told accounts how to balance. But it no longer reflected scarcity. This was the first major turning point. Japan had crossed from wartime finance into wartime monetary illusion. As shortages worsened, the gap between official prices and real value grew. Goods vanished from regulated markets and reappeared elsewhere. Savings accumulated that could not be spent. Wages were paid in full, but purchasing power declined in practice. Still, collapse did not come. Why? Because the state enforced silence. Information was controlled tightly. Official statistics lagged reality. Inflation was denied even as goods disappeared. Citizens were told shortages were temporary. Production targets were announced with confidence, and for a time, the system held. Factories continued to receive funding. Workers continued to report. The military continued to requisition supplies. The illusion of normality persisted not because it was believed, but because there was no alternative framework to replace it. Money, in this system, became a promise postponed. Every new note assumed future production. Every new loan assumed future victory. Every delayed reckoning assumed time. Time was the one thing Japan no longer had. Yet the financial system was designed to pretend otherwise. By suppressing prices, expanding credit, and denying inflation, Japan bought itself months, then years of continued operation. Not prosperity, not stability. Operation. This matters because it explains why collapse, when it came, felt sudden. The economy did not fall apart gradually in public view. It hollowed out internally. Value drained away quietly. Real resources vanished first. Money followed later. In this sense, Japan's wartime economy did not fail early. It succeeded too long. It functioned past the point where correction was possible. The illusion was effective, and that effectiveness delayed the inevitable while making the eventual breakdown far more severe. The war would not end with a financial panic. It would end with a revelation. But before that revelation, the system would be pushed further. Controls would tighten. Printing would accelerate, and the gap between paper wealth and real survival would widen beyond anything Japan had ever experienced. That is where this story is going, because the question is not why Japan collapsed. The question is how it managed not to, until there was nothing left inside the illusion to support it. As the war dragged on, Japan's financial system entered a new phase one defined not by balance, but by pressure. The illusion of stability now required constant reinforcement. Military demand did not slow, it intensified. Aircraft, ships, ammunition, uniforms, fuel, all were required in quantities far beyond peacetime capacity. Each order was backed by payment. Each payment expanded the money supply further. But the real economy could not keep up. Shipping losses reduced imports. Domestic production faced shortages of raw materials. Labor was stretched thin. Output targets were met on paper, missed in practice, or fulfilled through declining quality. Money continued to flow. Goods did not. This imbalance forced the state to choose between two dangers: admit inflation or deny it completely. Admission would trigger panic, hoarding, and loss of control. Denial required stricter enforcement, deeper distortion, and heavier reliance on paper finance. The choice was made. Price controls became absolute. Official prices were frozen even as costs soared. Wages were regulated. Rent caps were enforced. Rationing expanded to cover nearly every essential item. On paper, inflation did not exist. In reality, it was everywhere. The black market became the real economy. Food, clothing, tools, and fuel traded at prices far above official levels. Access depended on connections, geography, and risk tolerance. Money circulated in two forms: official and effective. The state knew this. It tolerated it quietly. Crushing the black market entirely would have halted distribution altogether. Allowing it to exist preserved minimal functionality. This contradiction became central to wartime survival. Meanwhile, the banking system was transformed. Commercial banks were no longer intermediaries. They became extensions of the state. Deposits were directed into government bonds. Credit was allocated according to production plans. Balance sheets expanded, but risk was irrelevant. The state guaranteed everything. This eliminated market discipline. Losses did not matter. Solvency was assumed. Future victory would settle accounts. The central authorities reinforced this assumption by absorbing debt directly. Government bonds piled up. New money financed old obligations. Interest rates were held artificially low. Savings increased, but not by choice. With goods unavailable and spending restricted, households accumulated currency they could not use. On paper, wealth rose. In reality, purchasing power fell. This created a dangerous calm. People were not spending. Prices were not rising officially. Statistics suggested stability. The absence of visible inflation masked the severity of underlying collapse. The system appeared controlled, but control required constant escalation. Each shortage demanded new rules. Each rule produced new distortions. Each distortion required more money to paper over the gap. Factories received funding even when output declined. Military contracts were paid even when delivery lagged. Wages were issued even when real consumption shrank. Money became a command signal, not a measure. This had profound consequences. Once money loses its role as a signal of scarcity, the economy stops adjusting. Misallocation spreads. Resources flow toward politically protected sectors. Waste increases. Productivity falls. Japan's wartime economy entered this phase quietly but decisively. The illusion worked because it aligned incentives temporarily. Workers reported because wages were paid. Managers complied because funding continued. Officials met targets because statistics could be shaped. No one wanted to be the first to admit failure. And so the system moved forward, powered by compliance rather than confidence. By the later years of the war, the scale of monetary expansion was extraordinary. Exact figures remain debated due to incomplete records and wartime secrecy. But all credible estimates agree on the direction. Currency in circulation multiplied several times over, yet prices did not respond until much later. This delay created a trap. The longer inflation was suppressed, the more explosive its eventual release would be. Price controls acted like a lid on a boiling pot. As long as the lid held, pressure built invisibly. The state responded by tightening the lid. Penalties increased. Enforcement intensified. Information control hardened. Public messaging emphasized unity, endurance, and patience. The illusion demanded belief, or at least obedience. But cracks were forming. As real goods disappeared, money lost credibility in daily life. Trust eroded slowly. People began valuing goods over currency. Barter expanded. Social relationships replaced prices as allocation mechanisms. The economy was fragmenting. Still, collapse did not arrive. Why? Because collapse requires a moment of recognition, a shared realization that money is no longer trusted. Japan's system prevented that moment by isolating individuals from each other's experience. Shortages were localized, prices were hidden. Data was controlled. There was no single point where belief failed all at once. The system staggered forward. This was the escalation phase, not a rush toward ruin, but a tightening spiral. Each turn preserved function while deepening fragility. Japan had succeeded in one thing above all else. It had delayed the reckoning. But delay is not avoidance. The longer the illusion held, the more violent its end would become. And by this point, there was no off-ramp left. Reversal would mean immediate collapse. Continuation meant collapse later. The path was chosen by default. The war would decide the timing. And when defeat came, it would not just shatter armies. It would rip the lid off a financial system that had been quietly hollowed out for years. The breaking point was approaching not because the illusion failed, but because reality finally caught up to it. The breaking point did not arrive with an announcement. It arrived with exhaustion. By the final stages of the war, Japan's economy was still functioning, but only in form. The machinery of finance continued to turn, yet the substance it was meant to represent had largely disappeared. Factories stood, but lacked materials. Workers showed up, but productivity collapsed. Money circulated, but meaning was gone. This was the moment when the illusion began to fracture. Military defeat accelerated pressures that had been building for years. Shipping losses cut off remaining imports. Domestic transport faltered. Energy shortages spread through industry. Output targets became fantasies maintained for morale rather than planning. Yet the financial system responded in the only way it knew how. More paper, more credit, more denial. Government spending surged even as revenue collapsed. Bonds were issued at a pace that assumed infinite absorption. Banks expanded balance sheets without concern for repayment. The monetary base ballooned. This was not reckless improvisation. It was institutional momentum. The system could no longer stop without imploding. Officials understood that tightening credit or lifting price controls would trigger immediate panic. The only option left was continuation, despite knowing it worsened the eventual outcome. This is where the costs became unavoidable. Real wages collapsed. Workers were paid nominally, but their pay bought almost nothing. Savings accumulated during the war years became meaningless. People hoarded goods instead of currency. Barter replaced cash in many areas. Trust, the invisible foundation of money, eroded. Not all at once, but enough. Markets fragmented. Rural and urban prices diverged wildly. Access mattered more than income. Networks replaced prices. Corruption spread not as moral failure, but as survival mechanism. The state's response was enforcement. Controls tightened further. Penalties increased. Inspections multiplied. Messaging emphasized discipline and sacrifice. Official prices remained frozen, even as goods vanished entirely. The gap between official economy and lived reality became impossible to ignore. At this stage, the war economy no longer functioned to produce outcomes. It functioned to delay acknowledgement. Who benefited from this delay? In the short term, the state did. It maintained command long enough to continue fighting. Military logistics remained funded. Authority held. Certain protected sectors also benefited. Those closest to distribution networks, procurement channels, or administrative power could still access resources. Inequality widened not by design, but by proximity to control. Who paid the price? Ordinary citizens. Workers lost purchasing power. Savers lost wealth. Small producers were crushed between price controls and input shortages. The black market flourished because it had to, but participation carried risk. This was not collapse. It was erosion, and erosion is often mistaken for resilience. By the time defeat became undeniable, the financial system was already beyond repair. The currency supply was vastly inflated. Price controls masked real values. Balance sheets were meaningless. All that remained was a shell. The illusion had succeeded too well. When the war ended, the state could no longer enforce silence. Controls weakened. Information flowed. Goods reappeared, but at prices that reflected years of suppressed inflation. The lid came off. Prices surged. Savings evaporated. The value of money collapsed in public view. What had been hidden became obvious overnight. This was the cost of delay. Had inflation been acknowledged earlier, it might have been managed gradually. Had correction been allowed, pain would have been spread over time. Instead, the reckoning was concentrated, sudden and severe. The system broke not because it was weak, but because it had been stretched past reality. Japan had used money as a shield against collapse. It had worked. But shields do not remove force. They absorb it until they fail. The breaking point revealed the truth that had been postponed for years. Paper promises cannot substitute for real resources indefinitely. The economy had not collapsed during the war. It collapsed when the war ended. That is the paradox at the heart of this story. Japan did not avoid disaster. It deferred it, and in doing so, it ensured that when the illusion finally shattered, there would be no gradual transition, only rupture. The final chapter is not about chaos alone. It is about what happens after illusion dies. How an economy rebuilds trust, how money is re-anchored to reality, and how the cost of buying time shapes everything that follows. That reckoning would redefine Japan's future more profoundly than defeat itself. When the illusion finally collapsed, it did so all at once. The war was over, the controls were loosened, and the truth rushed in. Years of suppressed inflation surged to the surface in a matter of months. Prices exploded. Currency lost value by the day. Savings that households had accumulated, forced, patriotic, and seemingly prudent, were wiped out almost overnight. What people had been promised during the war simply vanished. Money, once abundant, became meaningless. This was not a mystery to those who had designed the system. They knew the reckoning was coming. The only uncertainty had been timing. Wartime finance had delayed collapse, not prevented it. Peace removed the final barrier that held the illusion together. With defeat came transparency. Official prices could no longer be enforced. Black markets became open markets. Barter faded only because currency was rapidly being repriced by reality. The gap between paper wealth and real goods closed violently. Trust had to be rebuilt from near zero. The financial system underwent radical restructuring. Old balances were written down. Debts were redefined. Monetary reform severed the link between wartime paper expansion and the post-war economy. Painful adjustments were unavoidable. Who paid the final price? Ordinary citizens. Those who had saved faithfully lost purchasing power. Those paid in fixed incomes suffered the most. The cost of buying time during the war was concentrated on the population least able to absorb it. Yet the collapse also cleared the ground. Freed from illusion, the economy could finally adjust. Prices began to signal scarcity again. Production responded. Resources flowed toward real demand rather than administrative targets. It was brutal, but it was necessary. Japan's post-war recovery would later be described as miraculous. But that recovery did not begin with growth. It began with honesty, forced honesty about what had been lost. The lesson of the wartime economy was internalized deeply. Never again would inflation be denied so completely. Never again would money be treated purely as command without consequence. The experience reshaped institutions, policy, culture, and public attitudes toward stability. Fiscal discipline became central. Monetary credibility became sacred. The illusion had worked once. It would not be trusted again. This is why the story matters beyond its historical moment. Japan did not collapse because it mismanaged finance in ignorance. It collapsed because it used finance deliberately to delay reality. The strategy succeeded temporarily. Buying time can save a system in crisis. But time always comes due. Modern economies still face this temptation. In moments of shock, war, crisis, collapse, the pressure to paper over problems is immense. Print more. Borrow more. Delay adjustment. Sometimes, delay is survival, but delay always accumulates cost. Japan's wartime experience shows the full arc of that choice. From control, to illusion, to rupture, to rebuilding. It demonstrates how financial systems can be stretched far beyond their natural limits and what happens when they finally snap back. The collapse did not define Japan's future. The reckoning did. Out of that reckoning came reform, discipline, and ultimately recovery. But the price paid during the transition was enormous and avoidable only in hindsight. History rarely offers clean alternatives in real time. What it does offer are patterns. Japan quietly bought time with paper money. It used illusion to keep moving when movement seemed impossible. The question history leaves us with is not whether that choice was right or wrong. It is whether any society, facing the same pressures, would choose differently. Because when survival is at stake, reality is often the first thing a system learns to postpone and the last thing it can escape.